What's going on, everybody, and welcome back into Heated Shenanigans Podcast. I am your host, Scott, and as you can see, I am joined by one of the most decorated champions, wrestlers in history, TNA World Champion, multiple-time tag team champion, one half of one of the absolute best tag teams of all time, the Motor City Machine Guns, Mr. Alex Shelley.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
Not a problem at all. It is a true honor, Alex. Well, let's get right into this. You have been in professional wrestling for a very long time, and I got to know, over the course of your career, Alex, what would you say is the best story you have seen told in a wrestling ring? Not necessarily the match, but the psychology of what was going on in the ring.
Oh, wow. That's a really, really good question. I left TNA second time in 2012, and I signed with New Japan Pro Wrestling. And I signed there for a number of reasons, but part of it was I wanted to broaden my horizons as far as how pro wrestling is done. And I had experience working in Japan for 01 Max from 2005 until about mid-2006. So I'd spent quite a bit of time there. But I wanted to be a part of something new and something exciting for me internally so that I could definitely continue to have a passion for pro wrestling, which I think is so important. That's a long way around to say maybe a couple months into my contract, we had King of Pro Wrestling, which is one of the 4 big shows for New Japan Pro Wrestling at Ryogoku, a sumo hall, in October of 2012. And I remember watching Minoru Suzuki against Tanahashi. And to me, that match blew me away. Part of the reason for it was, if I recall correctly, there was not a single cover lateral press for a 3 count until the finish when Tanahashi hit a high fly flow. And it was simply amazing to me that they went as long as they did and used the methods with which they continue to succeed as far as submissions and picking each other apart via limb, the 5 points of balance, as Gordon Soley would say. And I just found this story that they told to be absolutely captivating. I'm not somebody who loves long pro wrestling matches per se. Sometimes matches go long, sometimes they go short. To me, the sweet spot is probably around 12 to 15 minutes, right? I feel like that's when people start to more or less gas out. They start to lose stamina, and they've thrown everything at their opponent that they possibly could. After that, who knows what it's going to look like. But these guys paced it so well, especially Suzuki being a combat athlete. And I just was absolutely mesmerized by the whole thing. And I think they went close to 30 minutes.
I agree with you on that sweet spot, like that's 12, 15. That's enough time. Everybody can get their stuff in. You can tell a good story and keep fans invested.
As an athlete, as a combatant, as a participant, you only have so much energy that you can expel, right? Everybody's gas tank is of various depths. It gets tiring. It gets very, very tiring if you're going really, really hard for even 3 to 5 minutes, right? You have different energy systems that come into play versus being able to go 30, 45, 60 minutes when you're using more of an aerobic pace. And then it becomes more of almost a marathonal type thing, right? You look at marathon runners and these guys aren't sprinting at any point of it, but they can still go, what's an ultra marathon, 30 plus miles. So there's different physical attributes that come into play.
Yeah. And, something else that I wanted to touch on with you on this episode, you've had such a decorated career in professional wrestling, claiming the TNA World Championship. Throughout the journey in professional wrestling, Alex, what year in particular do you think you experienced the most growth as a professional wrestler, and what led to that growth?
2005. I can pretty confidently say that. And what happened was, as is pretty frequent in pro wrestling, there was a change of bookers at TNA in late 2004. Come 2005, I was still under contract, but I wasn't being used. So I asked for my release because I wanted to go to Japan. I actually did a seminar the other day, and somebody asked me what I thought the best wrestling school was. And my answer was wrestling in Japan. And it really doesn't necessarily have to be for New Japan Pro Wrestling, even though they're the biggest company over there, but just the methodology with which they approach pro wrestling, I find to be incredibly educational. It's very hard for you to find somebody who's been to Japan and hasn't come back a better wrestler. There's a reason for that. So I started in Zero One Max, which was a company that had Masato Tanaka and Shinjiro Otani, and we had Kawada at the time, and Choshu came in, and all sorts of other great wrestlers like Akito Hidaka, who I think is the most underrated wrestler of all time. In March of 2005, and I was there until about a year later, and I was on every tour. So for me, doing that and then coming back to TNA later in 2005 and also working in Ring of Honor simultaneously was just awesome. Looking back on it, I would go to Japan for a couple weeks, come back that weekend, go to Ring of Honor. The next week, go to TNA for TV. The next week, go to Ring of Honor. The next week after that, go back to Japan. And I repeated that cycle for a long time. And that led to just so many different perspectives being shown to me and working with so many people who are so much better than me, which is truly how you get good, right? Like you work with people who are doing the things that you want to do. That year in particular was incredibly beneficial for me.
Well, say one thing I felt was really instrumental for you as a viewer. And I don't know how you felt about it. And this was my first introduction to you on TNA programming. Still there? Okay.
Yep.
My first introduction with you on TNA programming was the angles you were working with Kevin Nash on the Paparazzi production. What was it like to get that experience working with Kevin Nash, and what type of influence did it have on your career?
That's a really good question. And I'm glad we're piggybacking that off of me talking about how much I grew as a wrestler in 2005, because I started working with Kevin in 2006. Okay. So I learned everything I could about the mechanics of pro wrestling. Not everything I could, but I learned a lot in 2005. But there's a lot you have to learn about being a star. And there's a lot you have to learn about how you present yourself outside of the actual moves of professional wrestling, or what you're doing in between the moves is equally important. Things you do on your entrance, so on and so forth. So Kevin taught me all of that. Working with him, I gained this incredibly valuable perspective of how to carry myself during promos, how to carry myself, again, in between the moves, how to relax, or really truly like what subliminally gets over with people rather than what you're trying to portray. It's almost like going to a comedy show and hearing a really, really good comedian who's pretty naturally funny versus somebody who has written this script that they've changed 3 times in the past 3 weeks and they've memorized it, including laughing at their own jokes, right? Like that's the best analogy I could possibly give it. Kevin made me the comedian who was pretty comfortable being on stage and generally found to be funny amongst their peers.
And I thought like all the segments that you guys are in, like there are a lot of times you were in segments with Jeff Jarrett and Team Canada, and it added to the segment. It didn't overshadow or take away, but it was a needed piece to the segment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it was maybe things weren't originally written that way, but at the same time, when somebody goes in and they can add to it because of how they say something or their delivery or what naturally comes out of their mouths, you'd be a fool not to keep it, right? So it's a path of least resistance, but those segments were pretty fun.
Let's say a lot of people also know you from the time with Alex Shelley and Chris Sabin together as the Motor City Machine Guns. Do you think the idea and the concept for the Motor City Machine Guns would have worked with anybody else outside of Chris Sabin?
No, I don't think so, because it started due to me being asked who I wanted as a tag team partner at that point. And I picked Sabin. And part of the reason I did that was because we had this innate familiarity with each other because we've known each other since we were teenagers. Now, granted, at this point, we're only in our early 20s, mid 20s, but still there was a level of intimacy there. and we were such good opponents. We pushed each other very hard, but you just knew that, man, this guy's so good. He pushes me to be better. I look up to him in a lot of ways. A lot of it came from similar beats, similar rhythm, similar timing. And I think truly, as far as what made the Machine Guns special early on, that was what it was. It was like a rat-a-tat-tat, wear your opponent down, strike 4 times before they can strike once type psychology. And if I didn't have somebody who I could be so in sync with, I don't think I could have done it then. That's not to say that I didn't necessarily capture lightning in a bottle again when I went to New Japan with Kushida, because it was like the exact same phenomena, the same experience and intimacy that I had with him as well. And Saban confirmed that too, right? Like, so Saban went over there and teamed with Kushi in 2018, and he felt that as well. And that's part of the reason I think Time Machine, me, Saban, and Kushida, whenever we're together, is so special, because it really is these 3 guys who have just like perfect synchronicity together. And ultimately that's what it came down to.
Say, out of all the tag teams that you and Chris had the opportunity to work, which team had the best chemistry with you guys? Who helped complement you guys the best?
As far as who helped complement us, I feel like there's 2 ways to look at that. As far as who had the best chemistry with our particular style, that's also a different answer, right? So in a lot of ways, looking back on it now, I look at the matches with Team 3D and I think, oh my gosh, they were polar opposites of us. But man, I learned so much wrestling those guys, simply because they were from a totally different era and had wrestled totally different teams. And the way they put matches together, the things that they did, the way they approached tables and ladders and chairs, I kind of love doing that stuff. I'm not going to ask to do it, but I'm pretty good at it also. And I wouldn't be nearly as good at it. And Saban's quite good too. I should mention that, if we hadn't had those experiences with them. So they educated us in a lot of ways. And I think in that regard, they complemented what we did very well, right? Because you very much had like a black and a white. Like you had these gradients, right? So you had these direct comparisons, and it was very easy to understand that. Like there's these big, powerful, strong, tough guys. Here's these ultra lightning quick, athletic, younger guys. And that's a story that just writes itself. As far as who actually complemented our style the best, there's a few teams out there. I think Beer Money in a lot of ways was a good median between like what 3D brought to the table and what we were. I think as far as people who were in a totally different part of the world doing the same thing we did, Speed Muscle from Dragon Gate, Naruki Doi and Masato Yoshino were definitely like in the same vein as us. But as far as a team who literally complimented us the most, and this goes for Time Splitters and Machine Guns, I can say without fail, it's the Young Bucks. Like there's just no questions asked. And that's a team that I've got a very, very deep friendship with. I've known them for 15 years now. I helped them get their job at TNA. I've got the most respect you could possibly have for somebody for them. But at the same time, I've wrestled them the most. I think I've literally been in the ring against them, facing across from them more times than any other opponent I could possibly name. And that was because we did it on the indies. It's because we did it at TNA. It's because I did it in New Japan. It's because I did it in Ring of Honor. And it's like undulating with which team it was me being a member of, but still I did it so much. So I just think they're without a doubt the best complement to whatever style the Machine Guns created and Time Splitters picked up.
I would echo that 100%. Now, you not too long ago had the opportunity to capture the TNA Heavyweight Championship, an honor that many of us felt was long overdue for you to get. What did it mean to you personally and professionally to be able to achieve that championship?
I hear that a lot, like it was long overdue, and I respect everybody's opinion. How somebody feels about a situation, that's theirs. I didn't feel it was long overdue, and I didn't feel that way because there were so many points in my life where I would be all in on wrestling and then pull back hard on the reins because I approach situations a little bit differently. And I had these points in my life where I'd pull back hard and go deep into academia. And that's why I've got 2 bachelor's degrees and part of a master's. So education became my default in a lot of ways. And that's not to say I didn't love pro wrestling. I very much did. But I'm just somebody who doesn't sit in a situation and let themselves become unhappy. Like, time is of the essence. Life is too short. Why not put energy towards something else constructive? A lot of people who wrestle for a living are very frustrated and very unhappy. And I think that's natural because it's something that they love so much, but this is not objectively measured. This is not like any other 9-to-5 job with a 401k or a pension. Most people aren't going to have pensions nowadays, but you know what I mean. And because this is an art form that we are lucky enough to get paid for, when somebody doesn't see your art the same way you do, that can be incredibly aggravating. And that means they don't see the faith in you as an artist that others might, or you do. So I refuse to be that person. I don't want to be upset because somebody doesn't appreciate my art. Maybe in time they will. You know, like Van Gogh wasn't a superstar when he was alive. It was post-mortem that he became famous. Not to say that I want to be Van Gogh. At the same time, I felt like me winning the world title was a testament to how hard I worked. I had to step back from pro wrestling during COVID. I was working full time in physical therapy, and our company changed their mandates to where we had to get vaccination. And I understand why. Also, if we tested positive with COVID, at that point, you had to take a mandatory 2 weeks. And these are the rules, right? And I was very, very, very cautious about everything. I took so many COVID tests while I was wrestling during the pandemic. I was incredibly safe. I made sure I didn't put anybody at risk as best I could, as best as anybody could. But at the same time, this caused me to step away for about 8 or 9 months. And, if you're in wrestling and you step back like that, oftentimes your spot just boom, it's gone. It disappears and it's into the ether. And that's what happened with me. So I had to start from the ground up in a lot of ways. And I started with what I knew. I started with the independents and I found my way back into TNA. And by this point, I'm experiencing growth and I've got a different mindset, a different viewpoint on how I'm going to come back to wrestling. And I'm doing these really long, epic singles matches. And I came back to TNA and I was very, very lucky to have my first opponent push me to the limit. It was Jay White. And that was the match that brought me back to that company. I wanted that match. I wanted that experience. I wanted to wrestle Jamie. He's like my little brother. And I think from there, a lot of people thought, oh, whoa, like what happened to this guy? What was in that vaccine, And they realized there might be potential then for me to have the big belt. I try to approach every situation with the ideology that I can't control all that much. And I really don't think we can. As human beings, we can't control as much as we would probably like to. But I do the best I can with every match. And that's all I did. 2022, I had 8 days off the whole year because I worked 40 hours a week and I had over 100 matches. And that doesn't count like travel days too, right? So I only had 8 full days off. I worked as hard as I possibly could to have the best output I was capable of. And people recognized that. And eventually opportunity led to me getting a shot at the title and then winning it.
It was an incredible moment, all things considered. And last question here, Alex, before we wrap up this episode, is within your career, your time in professional wrestling, what would you say is one lesson that you learned that you did not expect to learn? And how did it change your career afterwards?
And I have said this one before, but I can't reiterate it enough because I feel like this applies across the board to anybody who's working in this industry, certainly the athletes in the industry. I started pursuing a degree in physical therapy in 2015 is when I started. And come 2018, I left Ring of Honor because my contract expired, which I knew that was going to happen. I had it all lined up, had it all figured out. And from that point on, I had to do many, many, many months of clinical rotations. So that's working for free as a student. And eventually the next year, I took the boards, passed, got my licensure. While I was working as a student, though, doing these clinical rotations, understand that there's different branches of physical therapy out there. And I always wanted to be an outpatient orthopedics, right? So I wanted to be the person like, oh, you tweak your back, you go to the clinic that I work in, right? We'll get you going in like a month, maybe 2, right? You had a surgery, you come in, might see it for like 3 months, you're out the door. Because I knew what I wanted to work in, of course, the idea is to give you like a taste of many different areas of the industry. So I worked in acute care. I worked in inpatient rehab. These are hospital settings. I worked in neurology, also a hospital setting. And what I saw was, and I'll never forget this perspective dawning on me very, very quickly, because mind you, I had just left professional wrestling. I'm working with very, very, very successful people across many different realms. And all they want to do is get up and walk. That's all they want to do. They just want to be able to get up and go to the bathroom on their own. They just want to be able to get up, go get the food that the nurse brought in, which is sitting on a table 5 feet away, and take it back to the bed on their own. And I think of all the times that I was frustrated with wrestling. Imagine how these people feel being frustrated with their entire life situation, justifiably. So the perspective I got, and this is something I never really expected, was we're so fortunate just to be able to do this, just to be able to have a singular match. Let's not even acknowledge the people that I just talked about. Let's ignore the population who like literally can't walk more than 5 feet. But let's think about all the people who spend copious amounts of time and money every year going to wrestling schools, and they just grind and grind and grind, and they try their hardest, and they still can't run the ropes. So for us to take for granted that we can do these things, let alone make some sort of livelihood out of this, is really something that makes you think twice about how you approach every single match, every single opportunity. And that's something I really try to impress upon people. And of course, it's okay to be frustrated or upset about something. At the same time, understand that like at least you're able to do these things. But man, that changed my life forever. Just having that experience in contrast to where I was coming from.
It's a very rewarding feeling and a field to be in for medicine and physical therapy. Alex, I want to thank you again so much for being on this podcast and doing this. Do you have anything coming up? Any activities, any appearances that you would be able to share with us?
No, but you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Alex Shelley 313. That should keep you updated.
All right, guys. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Heated Shenanigans Podcast. I want to thank Alex Shelley for being kind enough to join us today. Everybody enjoy this week, and we will see you on the next episode. Take